Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen, and this is Module 2, Crime, Criminality, and the Media Part 3. So this lecture is going to focus on something we call criminogenesis, and whether crime is basically beginning with the media, or how media generates crime. So criminogenesis refers to a process by which crime originates. So notice its focus is on the behavior rather than our social reaction to it. When we try to investigate criminogenic media, it turns our attention to how the media is a part of that process. And Surratt, in your textbook, emphasizes media as a more direct cause of crime. However, other theories and research show that maybe that's not the case. So we're going to talk about some of those discrepancies. So there are three criminogenic issues. First, does violence in the media generate aggression or even more violence? That's one you've probably heard before. And also, what is the relationship between media and terrorism? Finally, do media presentations encourage copycat crimes? We're going to get to the copycat crimes in a future video, but we'll look at that as well. So as far as violent media and aggression, we have two competing possibilities. The first one is the less likely one that you've heard, which we call catharsis, meaning that media portrayals of violence will permit an emotional release of anger and self-hatred, despair and self-loathing, so that they reduce our aggression or even let us aggress vicariously through our consumption of media. So we kind of get the hate and the anger out by participating in looking at aggressive or violent media. So we kind of have a release, if you will. This is largely unsupported by research. We really don't see this. The connections are not very clear, and we don't see evidence to back it up. The second one is one you've probably seen a little bit more, where it's one of stimulation, meaning that media violence contributes to aggression. It makes people more violent. By virtue of imitation, monkey see, monkey do. It fosters supportive moral or social values about violence. But we have some inconclusive evidence in the research about this. You'll find some articles that say, yes, we can see some evidence, and some articles that say, no, we don't see any. And so we don't have a firm grip of what we actually know here. Findings about the impact of media violence really do not have a clear conclusion, as I stated. While there are studies that do show a correlation or some kind of relationship between exposure to violence in media and aggression or violence, the effect is really quite limited. It only happens for some people, and for some people it's harmful, but for most of us, it's of little consequence. So really the true question is, for the people it does affect, what are other traits that need to be present to make it happen? Or what are traits that we have for people that it doesn't affect very well that maybe make us more resilient or immune to the effects? Those are really the more accurate questions that we want to ask. So media is intertwined with social processes, and that causal impact of media on aggression is completely overstated. I can't tell you how many papers that people propose to me, especially in my research methods class, of wanting to find the true and actual link between playing violent video games and being a juvenile delinquent or committing acts of violence like assault and robbery on victims. And every semester someone wants to study it, and every semester they find the same result, that there is not much evidence and they don't show much of a relationship at all, if any relationship. Some of the problems with that question are that it ignores other factors that are also important and actually more explanatory of why we see that aggression. And those factors include gender, education, neighborhood problems, income, coping abilities, social supports or lack thereof, or even personality traits. Or, adverse life events, exposure to trauma. There's just so many other things that have more power over a violent video game. Where this question came from most deliberately was in the Columbine shootings. So when Columbine happened in the 90s, the media uncovered very quickly that Dylan and Eric, the shooters that attacked their high school, loved violent or aggressive inducing rock music, and they loved playing violent video games and active shooter games. And again, this is where media kind of jumps in and speculates and say, oh, that's what it was. That's what pushed these two over the edge. It just completely ignores other predispositions or factors that highly predict things going on in their lives that led them to commit this vicious attack on their peers. So, I mean, you could take 100 kids and most of the time you're not going to see that effect. We do show other effects that are meaningful, where we see people maybe a little quicker to anger, maybe some irritability, or, you know, some of those kinds of things. But when we try to make that connection to violence, it's a bigger jump. So again, I can't say this, you know, even more intensely. We just don't see a clear connection. So I try to advise my students that come up with that question on that a little better, but at the end of the day, if that's a topic they want to do, I let them go see the evidence for themselves. But I encourage them to look at some other things too, so that they can see how it all plays out. So problems with establishing media as a cause of crime or criminogenic, basically originating or generating crime, are that really lots of aggression in society is actually socially acceptable or even sanctioned. So think about sports violence. It's legal and part of the game, and you're not going to see people criminally prosecuted for it unless it was done with malice or intent, or, you know, kind of there's some other things going on, the sabotage and these kind of things. You can maybe be sanctioned for being too violent or unsportsmanlike and those kind of things, but part of the hits in hockey or football are part of how the game is played. So we do have aggression and violence that is perfectly normal and fine. You can also think of aggression as business competition, where you need to be fierce and you need to attack your enemies, or maybe you're being very defensive, or you're being attacked and you need to fend them off. These are not criminal. So we have to recognize that some aggression is perfectly fine in society. You may have different opinions of that. But some aggression is actually very useful, where we think about aggressive acts that we need to do to self-preserve. Fear and anger are very useful emotions in self-protection. They can get us to flee something that's dangerous, or they can get us to fight back against something that is harming us. And so they can be very useful emotions, even though we don't like experiencing them and they feel very negative. They are there for a purpose. So we can't just say being angry, being aggressive, being violent is criminal, because it's not. It can be very purposeful depending on this context. And we can't emphasize context enough in a class like this. Many of these studies that have tried to examine media as a cause of crime have used laboratory studies, which to me is almost ridiculous. How do you actually replicate crime in a lab without doing something completely dangerous, unethical, or harming the people involved? So oftentimes those will not get approved by a research board, an institutional board. They'll say, no, you're not going to sit there and beat people and see how they do later. No. So the results aren't generalizable or accurate to the real world, because people are forced to use some kind of non-criminal measure of aggression, like irritability, or, you know, something that, you know, people in the lab can't be punished by. And so, you know, if you take something that isn't really real world and you try to replicate it in a lab because you're not allowed to really hurt people, how useful is that study? Not very. There are lots of possible effects on criminals as far as how serious a crime is, or maybe giving them ideas or ways to commit a crime. So we're not totally dismissing the idea of media and its relationship to crime. It's just harder to find the cause of crime for media. And remember that most crime is nonviolent, so any link to media is really superficial at best. Let's turn to our second point, which is media and terrorism. Now, I teach an entire class on this, so I'm just going to do some highlights, but I invite you to take my terrorism class. We have a whole section on just media that is fascinating and intriguing to study, I think. But when we look at media and terrorism, the relationship is a little more complicated. So here's just a basic definition of terrorism. There are many out there, and I talk about those in my class too. But terrorism is essentially premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated by subnational groups or clandestine agents against non-combatants, usually intended to influence an audience or produce fear or threat. So we have to get super technical with what is a terrorist attack and what is crime versus what is war, because all of these definitions can be highly technical and complex. So we say like non-combatants because, then we get into the territory of war. We say it has to have an intention of influencing an audience or producing fear and threat beyond just the act to separate it from everyday crime and violence. So terrorism is kind of borrowing from crime and also borrowing from war, but kind of for this symbolic means of creating change or supporting your cause in society. So note how the effort to influence an audience requires media participation. It's kind of like that proverbial tree falling in a forest. If no one hears it, it never happened. So really, terrorists are entirely dependent on media so that people can feel the fear and it can produce that threat. Virtually all terrorism is media-oriented for that reason. And really, it has a symbiotic relationship. So Surratt, in the textbook, talks about that relationship between terrorism and media as symbiotic, meaning it involves interaction between the two, and it has a mutually beneficial relationship, although we kind of cringe to hear that. So terrorists definitely need coverage and publicity. It gives them justification, and it helps them recruit people to their cause. But media thrives on producing a sensational story. It's very newsworthy, and it has dramatic appeal and attracts audiences. Even though maybe not for the right reasons, we don't want to sit there and watch people suffer or die. There seems to be something kind of inhumane about that. But we want to know about it because it's a real threat going on in the world. So some of the features of modern terrorism that are good to kind of be aware of as we talk about Surratt's take on this are that actions are really not tactical. They're really aimed at distant groups or audiences. So for crime, it's more calculated and more personal and localized. Terrorism, they don't really pay that much attention to the victims. They're kind of, in the infamous words of Timothy McVeigh, collateral damage to my cause, which again is terrible to say, but that's some of the perception that's out there. So victims are really symbolic to maximize fear and the public impact. And so they'll try to get particularly vulnerable victims or victims that have some meaning beyond them personally. So maybe they try to go after soldiers or military outposts. Maybe they go after political targets. Maybe they go after certain groups like women and children or certain religious groups. So it just depends on kind of their cause. Media really can be an accomplice or a witness to terrorism, and this is something that we discuss at length in my terrorism class. It's very vulnerable to manipulation by the terrorists because it really gives them fodder for their cause. Unwillingly, it still gives it to them. And governments are often really caught between the censorship of hands-off free speech approaches with regulation. They understand the relationship and they go, okay, well, if we censor coverage of terrorist attacks, that creates problems. If we're completely hands-off, that creates problems. So they're kind of trying to navigate the ground of this, and it's not easy, and every modern society struggles with this. So we have a coverage dilemma for news organizations. News outlets are wary of publicizing or helping the terrorists with the recognition that they inadvertently give them. And they're wary of being instruments of audience capture and the means by which terrorism becomes known. Lots of terrorist activities worldwide are not actually covered by domestic press, so it has to be truly sensational and often international for it to get coverage. And it also varies by time period. Obviously, terrorist activities are going to be more salient in certain political climates or time periods than others. But note the entertainment and infotainment value of the terrorist storyline that doesn't have a journalistic limitation. So terrorists use media, kind of closed captioned TV, videos, internet to send their message forward. In fact, the biggest threat and current threat that we experience today is social media, where we have Twitter feeds, YouTube videos, Facebook, and all the various social media outlets that produce direct contact to potential recruits, giving them instructions for attacks, to attack in your own homeland. You don't have to come to our training camps. You can wreak havoc where you live. And a lot of attacks between 2015 and now have been orchestrated that way. So it's not necessarily news outlets that sometimes facilitate terrorism. It can be other media. So some of our tentative conclusions about the criminogenic effects of media are really that media effects are quite real, but they are limited. Media alone cannot make you a criminal. It can't make you violent or aggressive, although it can influence you among other traits and in the right context and circumstances to do things. But again, we don't have as clear of research on that. The irony is in media is that it may be just as important in keeping people from doing things as causing an overt behavior like crime. So some of the impact on our lives every day are us making changes to our plans, not necessarily keeping us from committing criminal behavior, but maybe we refuse to fly somewhere because of air crashes or hijackings. We cancel a vacation because of drug-related violence reported in certain destinations. So it might be that we make life adjustments or plan changes because of things we see in the media, which may or may not be real or direct or a strong basis for making those changes. We have a perception that it's a problem, so we say, rather than find out for myself if it's real or not, I'm just going to avoid it. And that happens quite a bit too. Later on in the class, we're going to be looking at the Rupert Murdoch scandal, so in this module. So it suggests the question, perhaps media are the criminals. And we're going to take a look at this as an example, and it'll further investigate both those indirect and direct effects of media on crime. So I hope you found this helpful, and we'll see you next time.